Good morning. Welcome to the seminar, Teaching Writing, Structure and Style. The purpose of this class is to help you become the best possible teachers of English composition to your children and students that you can. My name is Andrew Pudawa. I'm the director of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, and it is a great pleasure and profound privilege to be able to work with you today. Before we get into the syllabus, it is very important that I give you a little bit of history about this program, lest you erroneously think that it is something I created by myself, which it is not. I am part of a team of teachers who teach a course called the Blended Sound Sight Program of Learning. It's a phonics-based reading and writing program that is taught in Canada each summer by a short little woman, very short, named Mrs. Anna Ingham. She is, I believe right now, in her late 80s, but she has a tremendous amount of energy and will tell you faster than you can possibly listen everything you would need to know to get your class of first graders all reading independently by November. She has single-handedly been fighting the great battle against whole language in Canada for decades. And it has been a great privilege to work with Mrs. Ingham and the Blended Sound Sight staff. My mentor is a man named Dr. Burton Webster. He is Mrs. Ingham's nephew, and Dr. Webster is a fascinating man because he lived and worked and taught in Africa for 16 years. He is a professor of African history, and he wrote an entire series of textbooks on African history for use in African schools by African children. And after 16 years of working in Africa, he returned to Canada and took up a teaching post at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, where he quickly found some problems in teaching history at the university level in Canada. And one of the biggest problems was, of course, he felt the students coming to him had writing skills that were, in his opinion, substandard, that it was difficult to teach history to students who could not write well enough to articulate history on paper. Thus, he began the process of designing a checklist-based program that he could give to his smart but untaught university students and help them learn how to write a good history paper as quickly as possible so that he could get about the business of teaching African history. Well, it was very interesting because, of course, what happened was gradually over the years, word got around Dalhousie University that if you wanted to learn to write well, you wouldn't mess with the English department. You would take Dr. Webster's African history class because he had this great system of teaching writing, and more people began to enroll in this, and over the 15 or so years he was at Dalhousie, it became, by the end, kind of a political problem because at one time 65% of all history department enrollments were in his sections, the ones he was teaching or controlling, which of course meant he had 65% of the budget and 65% of the graduate students, and the Canadian and European people couldn't understand why there was such a boom of interest in African history in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But at some point during that time, Dr. Webster came to help his aunt, Mrs. Ingham, teach the Blended Sound Sight Phonics Program summer course to teachers in Canada. And as he did that, he began to see that there were some application of the ideas he was teaching at the university also in other grade levels. And at one point, Mrs. Ingham's daughter, who would have been Burton's cousin, Mrs. George, she is a second grade teacher in Edmonton. She said to Burton, say, Burton, on your holiday, why don't you come over and do a little bit of writing with my second graders? Wouldn't that be fun? And Dr. Webster said, oh yes, that would be fun. So on his holiday, he came over and started to do some writing with her second graders, and he quickly saw some clear similarities between her second graders and his university students. And that was this, that both groups responded very well to the checklist idea, and both groups didn't really know what the finished product was supposed to look like. And so when he provided them with the models and the checklist so that they could know what they were supposed to come out of it with, they did, on both ends, second grade and university, much better writing. Thus began the process of Dr. Webster and Mrs. George, Mrs. Ingham, and many other brilliant Canadian teachers taking his university-level checklists and gearing them down for use at the second grade level. If you're curious about those checklists, they are contained in Dr. Webster's book, Blended Structure and Style in Composition, which is our textbook for the 10-day teacher training course up in Canada. The syllabus which I have provided you with as part of this course is really what I would call the bones and sinew of Dr. Webster's program. His book contains some muscle and a great deal of fat. It's the completed version, but really what you've got is, I think, a very effective outline. It is not, of course, meant to be a standalone text, which is why we're presenting the whole seminar as a class. When I put this together, I got in a little bit of trouble. Because you see, when we teach this syllabus in Canada, we do so over 19 hours of lecture and practicum time. And of course, we don't have that much time today and tomorrow. So if you feel by the end of this seminar that I've tried to compress a tremendous amount of information into a short period of time, I am trying to do exactly that. But I do think that it will be very, very valuable, because teaching writing is a difficult thing for many people and in many circumstances. We have a lot of problems. One of those problems is that children have very different aptitudes about writing. And if we have a classroom, we certainly have children on a wide spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have what I would call the 18-page girl. This kid can whip out a spiral notebook and start a story, and she writes, and she writes, and she writes, and you read the story, and it goes on, and on, and on. And you kind of think, wow, I wish I could help her make this more interesting somehow. But wow, can she put words on paper? And that's a wonderful aptitude and ability, and yet sometimes difficult to help. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, and I am not a gender-biased person, there are certainly boys on that end and girls over here, but typically we will find the boy who would rather scrub all the toilets in the building twice than have to put one paragraph on paper. Why? Why is this so difficult for this child? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, writing is very, very complicated. First, you've got to stay in the chair. Then, you've got to hold the pencil correctly so you do not get yelled at. Then, you've got to remember which way the B's and the D's go. And on top of all that, you've got to think of some words you actually might be able to spell correctly. And if you, on top